What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is The Real Win Rate. We're going to be thinking about the different ways in which poker players measure their success, and we're going to decide which of those ways is the most relevant. Now, the truth is, the way we define success does depend on what our goals are. But in this podcast, we're going to consider a series of different setups between player 1 and player 2. And depending on how we think about the situation, we might define player 1 or player 2 as the most successful. And there's not always going to be a right or wrong answer, but as we go through, you'll hopefully see the importance of thinking about this carefully, because the way that success is represented on, let's say, the poker forums is not necessarily a true representation of poker success in reality. So let's take our first scenario. As we go through these, think about whether you would rather be player 1 or player 2, and which is the bigger indicator of success in poker. So in our first scenario, player 1 is a 12 tabler, and he's played a sample size of 100k hands, and he has a win rate of 4 big blinds per 100 in the cash games. Player 2 has a higher win rate. Player 2 wins at 8 big blinds per 100 hands. However, player 2 has only played 2 tables, but has amassed the same sample size as player 1, 100k hands. So they have the same sample. Player 2 has double the win rate, but he only 2 tables, whereas player 1, 12 tables. Now, if we were to just see the graphs of these two players on the forums without understanding how many tables they've played, we would almost instantly say that player 2 is better than player 1, because player 2 has a win rate of 8 BB per 100, whereas player 1 only has a 4 big blinds per 100 win rate. But once we have access to the extra information, we realize that player 1 must have a significantly higher hourly rate than player 2. He's playing 6 times as many tables, probably results in about 5 times as much volume. So if player 2 has an hourly rate of $20 per hour, then there's a very good chance that player 1 has an hourly rate of $50 per hour, if we assume 5 times as much volume, but only half of the win rate. Now, which player would you rather be? Would you rather be the guy who has the very nice looking graph that you can brag about on the forums? Or would you rather be the guy who has the higher hourly rate? Now, most of us would prefer to be the player with the higher hourly rate, but it does depend on the context. For example, imagine you were doing some kind of win rate challenge or some kind of prop bet where your goal was to have a win rate of 6 big blinds or more. Obviously, it makes sense in those types of situations to cut down on the number of hands we played per hour, but to maximize our win rate. But for most of us, the goal is to generate the highest possible hourly rate. So we should really define player 1 as the most successful player here, despite the fact that his graph doesn't look as good as player 2's when it's posted on the forum. Okay, let's think about our second scenario. Now, in this second scenario, both players play the same amount of tables. We'll just say that they're both 12 tablers for argument's sake. And both of them have 100k hand sample. Player 1 has a win rate of 4 big blinds per 100, whereas player 2 has a win rate of 6 big blinds per 100. So player 2's made more money than player 1. However, player 1 has a really cool looking graph because a lot of the time his red line is break even and some of the time it's rising. In other words, player 1 has a positive red line overall. Remember, the red line represents non-showdown winnings. So player 1 has obviously been running some big bluffs and making some sick bluff catches. Player 2 is potentially, arguably, less interesting. He has a heavily falling red line. He's actually just playing a fairly solid, tight, some might say boring game of poker. But the end result is that over a big sample, he's making more money than player 1. And let's just imagine, even if we had an infinite sample, player 2 is making more money than player 1. Who would you rather be? Well, it's certainly true that players with sick-looking red lines draw more attention to themselves. They're certainly perceived by the general community to be stronger, more exciting players than player 2 in this instance. Maybe player 2 even gets accusations leveled against him of being a huge nit. The numbers stand for themselves. Player 2 is technically, in terms of win rate, a better poker player than player 1, makes more money, and has a higher hourly rate. So who would we rather be? Well, it seems that most of us would actually define success as being player 2, even though, and let's just say they were both streamers, many might say that player 1's actually more interesting to watch. Maybe he's overbetting more, bluff catching wider. But technically, it seems like we should define success as being player 2, simply because he has a higher win rate over a big sample. Okay, scenario 3. Player 1 has a huge hourly rate. But the reason why he has such a huge hourly rate is because he's playing against huge fish on some of these Asian apps. So really, there's not a lot of skill involved. And actually, if you consider the theoretical knowledge of player 1, it's not really that great. But because he's playing against ATV pip opponents, he can just generate a huge hourly rate, not because he's good, but because his opponents are so bad. Player 2 only makes $10 per hour, so that's 10 times less than player 1. However, player 2 is tackling some of the absolute toughest games online. His theoretical knowledge is way higher than player 1. He knows some really advanced concepts, and that's why he likes to take on tough opponents. But he only makes $10 an hour. That's below minimum wage in some countries, and it's not really a lot of money to live on. Whereas player 1 has a really comfortable living. He's making $100 per hour. Who would you rather be? And again, it's not necessarily black and white here, because if your goal when playing poker is to compete in some of the tougher lineups, well, player 1 is not successful at that. He's never played in any tough games, whereas player 2 is advancing towards that goal. But is that really your goal? Is your goal to compete with some of the toughest players in the world just for the competition element, or is it to make a bunch of money? So you can see success is really defined by what we're trying to achieve. Let's just assume that the goal of most of us is to generate the highest hourly rate. Well, player 1 knows a lot less about the game than player 2, but he's way more successful than player 2. And we can also see that being the most successful doesn't mean that we're necessarily a better poker player. There are some very skilled players out there who aren't that successful, and there are some relatively unskilled players out there who are extremely successful. Okay, scenario number 4. Player 1 is playing on one of those sites where it's fairly reg infested, but there's a huge amount of rakeback being offered by the room. Let's just say that player 1 is a very good affiliate, or he's going through a very good affiliate and he has an 80% rakeback deal, for example. Now, after rakeback, he's actually making 3 big blinds per 100 hands. But if we look at his actual graph before the rakeback is credited to his account, he's actually a slightly losing player. Now, player 2 doesn't get any rakeback. He's maybe playing on a room that has lower rake to begin with, but doesn't really offer as high of a percent in terms of rakeback. And if we look at his graph, he's making 1 big blind per 100, and that's before rakeback, but he doesn't actually have a rakeback deal, so that's just his overall win rate, 1 big blinds per 100. Now, player 1 is probably not going to be posting his graph on any forums because it's just a losing graph. There's not really a great reason why you'd want to post that. But technically, player 1's doing okay. He's not actually making any money before rakeback, but he's generating a fairly decent win rate after rakeback. And let's just say he's profiting month on month and making a fairly decent living from playing poker. Now, who is the better player here? It might seem like an obvious question. It might seem, for example, that surely player 2 is the better player because he's winning before rakeback, whereas player 1 is losing before rakeback and needs that extra rakeback in order to be profitable. That's not necessarily how this works. Perhaps player 1 is just being raked much harder to begin with. Perhaps if player 2 was put in the same raked environment as player 1, he might even have a worse pre-rakeback win rate compared to player 1. And we see this fairly often. The poker rooms that offer the high rakeback percentages often just take a larger amount of rake to begin with. If player 1 played at player 2's network, there's a possibility that he even generates a higher win rate than player 2 pre-rakeback. We don't necessarily know, but it's very common to assume that player 2 must be better than player 1 because player 1's actually losing, and the only reason player 1's making money is because he has a rakeback deal. But really we begin to see why win rate is not that important. In fact, anytime we're generating a positive win rate post-rakeback, it means we're defeating the player pool. In fact, if we have a win rate of -1 big blinds per 100 hands, but the poker room is taking rake off us at 10 big blinds per 100 hands, we're actually beating the player pool at 9 big blinds per 100 hands. That's just not quite enough to cover the amount of rake that the room's taking off us. By the time the room credits the rake back into our account, now suddenly we are generating profit. So in some senses, there's not really such a thing as someone who's a losing player, but makes money after rake back. We sometimes use the term rakeback pro, but it often has a fairly negative context, as if to say, you're only winning because of rakeback. If it wasn't for rakeback, you would be a losing player. But then we fail to take into account that such players might just be being raked harder than everyone else. So when we really analyze the final result, what's the most important thing here? And again, we're assuming that these players are playing a similar number of hands per hour. The most important thing here is going to be that win rate post-rakeback, regardless of what the graph looks like, because this is what's going to define the hourly rate, which again, for most of us, is the most important thing.
Hey, I just wanted to poke in real quick and say, first and foremost, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. But secondly, I wanted to make sure that you know one of the biggest win rate killers is actually your preflop hand selection. Most people think this is just a completely automated part of the game, and they don't really put too much stock or thought into their preflop strategy until it starts getting challenging and they realize, postflop's getting a little bit trickier. I'm finding myself in spots I'm not 100% sure if I should be, and a lot of that should boil back to, am I playing the right hands preflop? If you're not 100% sure, and let's be honest, most players aren't, you should definitely make sure to download the new GTO Poker Rages app by Red Chip Poker, search for it in your app store of choice, and really make sure you're solidifying your preflop game. That means open raises, 3-betting, 4-betting, and everything in between. This is very, very important if you want to maximize your win rate overall. So go download the app today at redchippoker.com/app to learn more and get all of your download links, and make sure to check out those open raising ranges if nothing less. They're 100% free, or you can always upgrade, unlock the entire app, and get everything, including all of our GTO ranges, exploitative ranges, and more ranges coming in the future. So again, redchippoker.com/app, or search for the GTO Poker Ranges app in your app store of choice. And with all that said, I'm going to kick it right back to Coach Weasel. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
Okay, our next scenario. Player 1 has a win rate of 1 big blind per 100 hands over a fairly large sample. But his EV line says 6 big blinds per 100 hands. So it seems that player 1 is running bad. Now we know that the EV line doesn't really give us the full picture. It's not necessarily a guarantee that player 1 is running bad just because he's 5 big blinds per 100 lower than his EV line. But let's just say this is a more accurate version of EV, and we know that player 1's EV should be 6 big blinds per 100 hands, and he only has a 1 big blind per 100 win rate over the sample, so he's clearly running bad. Player 2 is a break-even player in EV. His EV line says 0 big blinds per 100 hands, but he actually has a win rate of 6 big blinds per 100 hands over this fairly large sample. So he's running really good, and he's making quite a bit more money than player 1 over the sample. Who would you rather be? Would you rather be the guy that's lucky? Or would you rather be the guy that's good? Now I expect this one to maybe divide opinions slightly because there's a popular saying out there, it's better to be lucky than good. And that's kind of true. If this was the only sample size of hands that we would ever play, it's probably better to be the lucky guy. But assuming that we're going to go on to play an even bigger sample, Well, it's better to be the guy who has the skill set that can generate 6 big blinds per 100 in EV. Player 2 doesn't have that skill set. Over the next sample, player 2 is very likely to break even, or may even run bad and actually generate a loss rate over the coming sample. So we can see in the long run, it's better to be the guy with the higher win rate in EV, even if we sometimes run bad over a certain sample size. So seeing as luck will even out in the long run, it's probably better to be good than lucky. Okay, our next scenario. Player 1 binks the World Series of Poker main event and collects a huge payout, but doesn't really have a lot of poker experience and is generally quite bad at poker. And if you are wondering whether such a thing would ever be possible, well, it's happened in the past. We've had very weak players binking the WSOP main event. Then we have player 2. He is a tournament grinder. Unfortunately, he didn't bink any huge events, but he does generate a sustainable long-term income from grinding tournaments. Who would you rather be? Now, I can imagine listeners answering either of these because on the one hand, player 2 is obviously more skilled and has that future EV and that ability to keep generating income in the future. But player 1, if he protects that tournament win and doesn't blow it all on other tournament entries, he's actually fairly set up for life. He could maybe invest that money in something. And certainly in terms of the way things are perceived, the World Series of Poker main event winner is going to attract some measure of fame. They're going to be in news articles. They're going to be on the televised poker events. So from an outsider's perspective, from a non-poker player's point of view, the perception is that player 1, the World Series of Poker main event winner, is a lot more successful than player 2. And even some poker players might agree with that. They might think, well, okay, player 1 doesn't really know how to play, but at the end of the day, he ran good when it matters, and that's how we define success. Could be that some players see it that way. In these types of situations, I like to make use of a thought experiment, and that is to imagine that each of these players doesn't have 1 lifetime, but they have 1 million lifetimes. Now, in those 1 million lifetimes, how often is player 1 going to bink the World Series of Poker main event, given that he has relatively little poker experience? Probably not many of them. In fact, this might be the only lifetime in which player 1 actually binks the World Series of Poker main event. In how many of those 1 million lifetimes, given player 2's skill set, is he going to be able to generate sustainable long-term income by playing tournaments? And the answer could very well be all of them, or at least most of them, depending on the circumstances. So with that in mind, should we still define player 1 as the most successful? Ultimately, it's your choice. Depends what your goals are. And it depends to some extent how you define success. We might value the perception of being successful more than actually being successful. And if that's the case, we would definitely prefer to be the World Series of Poker main event winner and have the fame and prestige that comes with that. And we see this idea, the perception of being successful rather than actually being successful, permeates the way that players post their results and experiences online. Simple example of this is our next scenario, and most of us have seen this. Someone shows up and wants to post their sick win rate over 8,000 hands. They've been crushing everyone at 25 big blinds per 100 hands over 8,000 hands. And there's no one that can tell them that actually you might just be running good. No, this 25 big blind per 100 win rate over 8k hands, according to player 1, is purely a result of their skill. And they maybe even say something like, well, I might expect my win rate to be a bit lower than this, but I think I can still generate 20 big blinds per 100 hands against this player pool because I'm so good, etc. Player 2 has 500,000 hand sample, and he's got a win rate of 2 big blinds per 100 hands. Now, that's his actual win rate because it's such a big sample, so it's probably not going to be hugely different from that. sometimes players look at a graph like that and say, well, it's a fairly low win rate. I know this guy who had 20 big blinds per 100. In fact, 25 big blinds per 100 over the graph he posted, ignoring the fact that that graph was an 8K hand sample. So we can see we have two players. One's actually successful, but has a fairly low win rate. The other one, having a win rate over 8K hands, is no indicator of success really, but there's potentially a perception of success that surrounds that extreme result over a small sample size. So what would you rather be? Would you rather be the guy who's actually successful but has maybe a lower perceived success because of a low win rate, for example? Or would you rather be the guy who's maybe perceived to be successful by those who don't really understand what they're looking at, but actually there's no proof of your success so far because the sample size is too small? So our next example, we have player one who's a theory expert. Let's just say he knows everything about everything. He just doesn't play very much. In fact, he spends most of his time in the poker lab generating strategies, most of which he never actually deploys at the table because he just doesn't really play very much. It's very low volume. We then have player two who has fairly average knowledge. Maybe we could say slightly above average because he's a small winner in the games he plays, but he has a jam-packed volume schedule. His hourly rate might not be especially high, but he works really hard, puts in a lot of volume, and as a result, has a fairly impressive annual return. In fact, he makes quite a bit more money than player one. Who would you rather be? And again, it depends how we define success. If our goal is simply to know everything about everything and be an expert on poker theory, then player one is technically more successful. But if our goal is to make money, then player two is actually more successful despite not knowing as much about the game as player one. Once again, we see this ironic relationship where your success in poker is not directly correlated to how good of a poker player you are. There are some less good poker players out there who are significantly more successful than some of the poker theory experts out there. Let's take a look at our final scenario, and this is related to the area of bankroll management. So we have player one who absolutely crushes low limits. 10 big blinds per 100 hands. He has some really sick graphs. He usually posts them in big blinds, by the way, because it's not so cool when you have a 2NL graph and it's a huge upswinging green line for like $72 or something like that. It looks much cooler when it's in big blinds. And then we have player two. He doesn't have a win rate that's anywhere near as high as player one. Player one has 10 BB per 100. Player two only has 1 BB per 100. His big blind graphs don't look anywhere near as good as player one's. But player two moved up aggressively every time he had the bankroll for it. And he's now playing nosebleeds. So who would you rather be? Player one with the sick graphs, who's crushing 5NL for 10 big blinds per 100 hands? Or would we rather be player two, who has some fairly swingy looking graphs and some fairly big downswings, but is playing 40 KNL online, for example, at the highest level, and still generating a 1 big blind win rate per 100 hands? As you might imagine, 1 big blind per 100 hands at high stakes or nosebleeds is going to dwarf the amount of money we'll earn with a 10 big blind per 100 win rate at micro stakes. So as we can see from this final example, poker is usually not actually about win rate. Despite all of the attention players put on generating a high win rate, that's really not what this game is about in most cases. For most of us, poker is about generating income. And as a result, it's better to have a fairly low win rate at a very high limit than have a very high win rate at a fairly low limit. Well, that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening, guys. Hopefully this is going to help you to think about win rate and how we define poker success in the most accurate way. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.